In this series, we're going to be talking about different logical fallacies. This is not going to necessarily be an exhaustive list. Unfortunately, there are way more ways to make a incomplete or illogical argument than we will cover. We're just going to go over some of the biggest ones that come up. So just before we get started, to be clear, a logical fallacy is an element of an argument that weakens that argument. So it's something about the way the argument is set up, something about the reasoning behind it or the evidence used in it that means that it's a weak argument. The tricky thing is sometimes we can't always tell. When we say a weaker argument, we mean logically. Doesn't mean it doesn't appeal to us emotionally, doesn't mean it doesn't get people riled up and on board with whatever, but it just means that logically it is a weaker argument. This word fallacy on its own just means a mistaken belief. So the first one that we're going to talk about, and the one for this video, is called the slippery slope logical fallacy. Slippery slope fallacy is essentially when we say that one thing will for sure lead to another thing. And typically that second result that it will lead to is something very drastic, very dire, very doom and gloom. This is essentially a scare tactic. We're saying if we let this one thing happen, look at all these bad things that are going to happen. This is effective, although illogical, because it gets people to care about the issue at hand so that they can avoid all of these terrible consequences. For example, maybe you don't care about your kid's school day being shortened by 15 minutes, but if you use a slippery slope argument and talk about how this means that they're not going to get the right education and they're going to be out on the streets when they're older and not have a successful life, that's a pretty big jump from one thing to the other, but it gets you scared enough to care in this case. This is a logical fallacy because it's based on the assumption that A leads to B leads to C, that one thing leads to another leads to another. If it's not proven that this first thing leads to the next thing, then there's really no basis for the argument here. And we'll see that. Let's take a look at an example. So we have one example that we're going to look at together today. This is from our book, True Enough, but later on, so we won't get to it for a little while. This is a quote from a movement that was used to try to make sure that there wouldn't be a federal ban on cigarettes. And so I'll just read the quote to you. It says, "The move to restrict cigarettes," he warned, "would harm everyone, not just smokers. Because once the government banned cigarettes, it'll go for liquor and fast food and buttermilk and who knows what else. There's a line of dominoes a mile long." So the argument here is that if the government bans cigarettes, that's opening it up to ban anything else, right? They could go for fast food next and make sure that you're not allowed to eat or sell fast food and make that illegal. This argument is part of a logical fallacy, right? Because there's absolutely no evidence showing that because the government restricted cigarettes, they would restrict fast food. Of course, they could, but there are a lot of things that could happen. However, this argument still got to a lot of people, right? A lot of studies showed that cigarette smokers were not necessarily sympathetic or that there wasn't a lot of public support for them, but there was a lot more public support for people who were saying like, hey, yeah, wait a minute, I don't want the government stepping in on all of these different things. So again, we get that kind of scare tactic element of trying to warn people of something, of trying to get people up in arms, to care not just about the one small thing at hand, but to make sure that they feel like there's a bigger implication around it. So that's how the slippery slope logical fallacy works.